an update. So you may remember, I mean, it's the 10-year anniversary of these states coming into the European Union. That meant that in 2004, we had in the European Union what is considered, or what's called by the nickname, the Big Bang enlargement. Because this was the largest enlargement that the European Union, that club of fellow-minded countries, that single market, that was the largest enlargement that they had on that time. They enlarged from 15 member states, mostly in Western Europe, the ones that you know, right, to 25. 8 of them were Central and Eastern European. And just to give you, so just to give you an idea, right? So here you got the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia. Do you have a pointer? Yeah. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Baltic states. Then you have Poland, the biggest of the new member states. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia. And then your little island of Malta here, and the Greek part of Cyprus. Again, these are obviously not sort of Slavic, Eastern Europe, Central Eastern European countries. Romania and Bulgaria joined 3 years later in 2007 because they couldn't fulfill in 2004 all the requirements that the European Union set for them. So that brings the EU now to 27 members, and then in 2013 we had the accession of Croatia here, right? In July 2013, Croatia, another Balkan country, joined as the 28th member state of the European Union. But let me go back to so. So I'm talking here mostly to give you some ideas about how the EU perceives the inclusion of these countries. And there's an important term in that regard, and that is called Europeanization. Okay? Europeanization. And Europeanization is, let's look at the definition, are the various causal mechanisms through which EU policies, institutions, and the political processes, the politics, impact upon the domestic structures of the member states. So Europeanization means that the European Union has a significant influence on domestic policies, right, and processes in those member states. The degree of Europeanization is different from country to country. That's why we see nowadays quite a variety in how these countries have fared, right? Poland has very much been a success story, whereas, for example, Hungary is almost the opposite, right? Of a country that has regressed in democratic rights and in many other politics. So, how did the EU try to achieve the Europeanization? You may know that, right, these countries all became liberated, democratic, after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, 91, and one of the first things they did, they were looking to the West. One thing was NATO inclusion for the security against Russia, and the other was looking towards the accession to the EU's single market and the European Union more generally. Okay? But you cannot just become a member very easily. In fact, these countries had to go through years of adjustment processes to be ready for EU membership. So many of these members started in the mid-90s, right? From 94 to 98, and it took them till 2004 or 2007. So we're talking here between 5 and 10 years of preparation to get into the European Union. Okay? And that was because the European Union has the so-called conditionality, which you have highlighted here, the second paragraph. Okay? And they were called, the European Union in 1993 established the so-called Copenhagen criteria. And there are 3 fundamental aspects or criteria that each of these aspiring members, these candidate member states, need to fulfill. Those are, they need to have a functioning, first, they need to have a functioning market economy. Okay? Remember that these were all post-communist countries. They had to fundamentally change from a Soviet communalized economy to a private economy. Okay? Secondly, they had to respect the rule of law and human rights, rights for minorities, and so on. Okay? That meant anything from making sure that the government is more transparent, that the judiciary is independent, that the human rights clauses are inserted in national constitutions, and so on and so on, right? So that you're basically on a liberal democratic level, not only on an economic level that can work with the EU single market, but you're also a liberal democratic level with the other EU member states. And thirdly, they needed to have the ability to apply or implement the EU's treaties. And now some of you may know a little bit about the EU's treaties, right? The EU functions on the basis of treaties. But what these countries had to do, they had to apply 80,000 or implement in their country, in their government, 80,000 pages of legal conditions and texts and treaties into their own governance process. 80,000 pages. That's a tremendous task. So no wonder it took them quite a while, right? And only once all these three criteria are fulfilled, then the European Commission in Brussels, the EU's executive, together with the European Council, the representation of the member states in Brussels, they will make a joint decision to allow a country in. And while they are preparing those 5 to 10 years, every year there was an accession report in which the European Union looked at, okay, how are they doing in the rule of law? How are they doing in the independence of the judiciary, right? How are they doing in improvements in environmental policies? And so on and so on. But once they get in, once they are ready, or certified as ready, and they become a member in 2004, that conditionality is really not given anymore. Because now they are full members of that club, the European Union, right? And that's a little bit of a problem that we have to acknowledge, okay? So because before, these countries, remember, they were either, if you think of, they were coming out of the totalitarian systems, right? A rampant corruption, low economic productivity, and so they had to restructure everything in the economies and in their government. And they were doing that under EU pressure to become part of the club. But once they are part of the club, there is no continued pressure on them. Okay? So what political science have called it at some point is some sort of backsliding or receding of the quality of their government in some cases. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to express here. Okay, while pre-accession conditionality got locked in through the application of the EU's conditionality Copenhagen criteria, it often remains very shallow, and the EU loses that pressure once they are full-fledged members of the European Union. So, as almost like a strategy, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, that's CEE, Central and Eastern Europe, these countries formally adopted a massive amount of policies and institutions to satisfy the demands of Brussels, but they were often, or are still today, not properly applied, implemented, or enforced. And, importantly, they have not changed necessarily the behavior of the governmental actors, nor their attitudes. Okay? Actually, a Croatian political scientist, a friend of mine, she called it sort of, a lot of what was happening, what was going on in Croatia was that we built up, in order to accede to the European Union, sort of, some of you may know the Potemkin villages, right? So we have sort of almost like a fake implementation. We came up with these laws that our parliament, the Croatian parliament, passed, so that Brussels is satisfied. But what happened after it passed, that it was just on the books, but not implemented, nobody really cared about that. Nor did the EU have the power to enforce that or monitor that. So deep Europeanization, that's what the EU eventually would be looking for, requires a normative incorporation, right, of EU norms and rules, so that governmental actors in the Central and Eastern European countries, as well as, of course, in every EU member states, that they incorporate the political orientation and the political level of quality of decision-making processes in the EU. Now, that sounds kind of pessimistic, what I just told you, but that's why I added the question here, right? initially, maybe you can say a little bit more about that. Was there really an alternative in the early 90s, right? So I think the question, some people, some citizens in those countries now think that there may have not been an alternative at all. It was, they became independent and suddenly they were already again under the pressure from the EU. They had no time to really be independent and sovereign for a long time. Okay, so now to the next question, did Europeanization occur, or in what sectors? And basically you can here make a difference between, where you can look at two different aspects. The economic aspects, in which most of the Central Eastern European countries did fairly well, and are still doing well. And of course, so political criteria. And that's where there are more problematic issues still, 10 years later. So let's look at a little bit at the economy here. So the EU influence here is between those countries' economic catching up, okay? That meant these countries, remember, had to restructure the economy totally from a public economy to a private economy, right? Outdated infrastructures to modern infrastructure. They had to move from industrial and agricultural societies to service-based societies. Okay? All of these were fundamental transformations. So that was very difficult initially, but they had a couple good points. One of them, or very importantly, lower wage costs. Meaning that once they joined the EU in 2004, the people working in these countries, producing cars or whatever it was, of course, were receiving much lower wages. That made them very attractive, these countries, for foreign direct investment, for companies from other countries to set up in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Poland, right? And guess what? Many West European companies, particularly, let's say, German car makers, I remember that because I'm German, right? German car makers, they relocated a lot of their Volkswagen or whatever companies to Slovakia and Hungary because the wages were lower there. And also the corporate tax rate, by the way, was lower there, okay? So there was almost like an inner European movement of companies from Western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe. Also, of course, that was combined with a fairly well-trained and well-educated labor force. Education was always important during the Soviet time, right? So you had a fairly well-educated labor force that was working much cheaper than the Western Europeans. Very attractive. So in that case, these countries really experienced a sort of boom. And just to illustrate that here, or maybe not here, this is, remember, I'm going back to that slide, this is the GDP forecast, the gross domestic product forecast for 2015. So we cannot really take this 100% for granted because there's a projection out in the future. But as you can see here, if you just look at these countries nowadays, Lithuania and Ireland are the only ones who have 3% and more economic growth, okay? But then most of the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe are in the dark green area, which are between 2 and 3% economic growth. That is way higher, as you can see, than almost all of the Eurozone countries, the countries using the euro here, right? Except for the UK, but the UK, remember, still has the pound. Okay? So in that sense, that tells us that these countries economically really were fairly successful in attracting foreign direct investment, in restructuring the economy. They even weathered the euro crisis relatively well. Poland was the only country, amongst all of them, Poland was the only country that did not experience a downturn during the global crisis at all. And just to show you that as well, but yet there's still some catching up to do. If you just look at this is the GDP per person, so the overall GDP divided by citizens, the number of citizens, in 2013 in thousands of euros. And you can still, if you look here at the top, all of the ones on the top are, Luxembourg is an outlier, okay? But all of the top are sort of the Western European EU member states. And look at the bottom. All of the ones on the bottom, the bottom 10 are all Central and Eastern European. Okay? So they had to start really from the very bottom, and even today, after 10 years, they haven't caught up by far to even the EU average, right, which would be somewhere located around, what, 25, 30,000 euros. They also, one good thing that's particularly pronounced, of course, during the euro crisis, but I don't want to get into it right now, was that these countries also had less public, governmental, and private debt. Okay? Because the Western Europeans, EU member states, they were able to accrue much more debt over the past decades. Whereas these countries, because of their structural transformation, they didn't have much resources, so they didn't spend, these countries didn't spend so much publicly, right? And the private consumers didn't spend so much either. So that's actually, that helped them somewhat through the euro crisis. Okay, so this is the economic sector. Fairly successful, okay? But as you saw, not quite there yet, particularly in GDP per capita. Now, politically, it's more problematic. Of course, we have countries like Poland, the largest member states, very successful. Poland, sometimes ironically, I have to point this out as a German, it's called sort of, the Poland is sort of the second Germany in the EU, right? So it's going to assume the leadership position for the new member states, or for Central Eastern Europe, within the EU. But there are many other countries, particularly Hungary. We have also issues, right, in Romania, Bulgaria, where else? There are a number of other countries. The Czech Republic had a couple of issues in the past years, and Slovakia, where there's a more problematic political culture. Okay? And just to give you some examples, one is the problem of endemic corruption. And I know Professor Kostadinova is an expert, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But if you just, again, compare Western Europe and Eastern Europe, you see that there still needs some work to be done. This is from Transparency International, the world's largest anti-corruption NGO, and they come out with a ranking, worldwide ranking, of the state of corruption in the countries. Now look at the top 13 countries, here on the very left. Number 1, Denmark and Finland are in the same level. Okay. Followed by Sweden. Okay, Switzerland is not an EU country. Norway isn't either. But Netherlands, Iceland, Luxembourg, Germany, right? Then Belgium, United Kingdom, France. These are all Western European countries. And if you look at the Eastern or Central Eastern European countries, right? The first country that appears is Cyprus, right? 29. And then Estonia, number 32, that's out of 175 or so. And then you see here, most of the countries are in the 40 to Romania 66. But then again, we got Italy, right? 72, a Western European old member state. So, and Bulgaria, number 75, and Greece again, a Western European, 94, right? So there are some issues in terms of, for example, corruption, but also populism, general populism. That has maybe a little bit to do, but I leave this to the expert in domestic politics, with the fact that many of these countries really didn't have much of a choice initially after they became independent, right? And they were basically almost like occupied by the European Union. That now, particularly after the euro crisis, after having made all these changes, there's a certain disenchantment with Europe, as well as with the domestic government, and that populism is emerging in many of these countries. But make there's no doubt about it, populism is also emerging in Western European countries, increasingly, okay? Based on the effects of the euro crisis. And there are some issues with racism, so if problems with peoples or populations that fall outside the mainstream population in these countries, and there can be anything from the Roma issue, which is, you know, the Sinti and Roma, which is a big, long-standing problem in Central and Eastern European countries, all the way to LGBT, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender populations, which also have a very hard time. And both the Roma, or in general minorities, social minorities, are held in high regard. The respect for minorities is one of the fundamental conditions for EU membership. But obviously there are some issues still, despite being in the EU, in these countries. Another refers to what we would call, when we call countries democratically consolidated, and that means sort of a mature, stable democracy. And again, I will just touch on that because there have been some constitutional changes or also electoral engineering going on when electoral laws are being changed in favor of the ruling party. These are things that should not occur, right? There should not also be a one party governing, there should be an alteration in governmental power over time. So there are some issues in that regard. Also the independence of judges, the independence of the police, and press freedoms. Things that we take for granted, things that the West European countries take for granted, maybe except Italy and Greece, if I may dare say so. We have problems here in these factors, but again, I think Professor Kozadinova may say a little more about that. And there, of course, there are mixed results in terms of how what has happened in the EU. There are mixed results regarding the labor movement and migration, inner EU migration. Okay, because what happened in 2004 when these 10 countries joined, remember, many of these people there, they didn't see much hope in their domestic economy, so they went actually to Western Europe, most often to the UK. To the UK and Ireland alone, there were over 1.5 million Poles migrating to the United Kingdom and Ireland. There were many other Central Eastern European citizens moving to Germany, my home country. And I remember that these deep debates in Germany, they were quite xenophobic. And the European Union even established temporary restriction on the movement of people from Central Eastern Europe, which is actually a right that every EU citizen has. There is an interesting case right now. Now there was a case about welfare tourism, that these citizens from these countries would go to Western Europe and apply for unemployment benefits or other welfare benefits from the rich Western states. And because they're EU citizens, that they may be able to get those. But just on Monday, the European Court of Justice came out with a judgment that's applicable, legally binding for all EU member states, that that's not allowed. Labor movement of labor, of people, in the EU is free, but you're not allowed to go to another country, not work, and then apply for their unemployment benefits. Just to give you an idea of some of these heated issues that are occurring in the EU right now. Okay, so what are some of the takeaway thoughts that I want to leave you with is, one is to remember that there is no general answer or no general classification for Central and Eastern European countries 10 years after exists. You really have to look at it country by country, right? Like I said, Poland is sort of the star of the Central Eastern European countries, whereas Hungary is the most problematic child. But as a region, if you wanted to do it, the region itself, particularly politically, has not quite been so successful, I would dare to say, than, for example, newly democratized countries such as Spain and Portugal, which only democratized 30 years ago as well. The second point, not only, of course, is the impact of Europeanization of the EU through the EU important, but you also need to have a domestic liberal democratic support groups. Okay? So if you don't have a vibrant civil society, and you don't have, lots of linkages between the EU and Western European member states and Eastern European counterparts, domestically you cannot build an organic liberal democratic society. And, well, there has been the argument made here on the bottom. Some have said that, you know what, that enlargement of these Central Eastern European countries has occurred too quick. We should have waited longer to see if they eventually consolidate and mature as a democracy. So the EU has now become more hesitant, more critical against, for example, the future enlargement candidates such as Serbia, right, Montenegro, Albania, maybe even Turkey. And now the EU has one important power, and that's of course the power of the purse, the money. The Central Eastern European countries received a lot of pre-accession funds, as well as so-called regional funds, or support for their farmers, because their farming sector was pretty large. In the past, these countries fairly unconditionally received these funds. From now on, in the new 7-year framework, the EU will link the receiving of those fundings to economic and social objectives that the EU has. So they're trying to increase conditionality to receive funding when you're a member state. Does it make sense? They're delaying and scrutinizing further enlargement, so Serbia will have a much harder time getting in than, for example, Poland in the future. And of course, the EU now increasingly also has to look at Russia, because Russia, as we'll hear in a second, is a major destabilizing factor, trying to destabilize countries such as Hungary, Serbia, and others from the EU path. Thank you for your attention.
Talking. Okay, not to waste time. So, the title of my topic is basically bringing these two parts or three parts of Europe together. This is what started to happen since 2004, bringing together Eastern, Central, and Western Europe. I want to start with an observation that by admitting 8 East European countries in 2004, the European Union was also affected. And one of the ways through which it was affected was the kind of people who, new citizens of the European Union who were just joining the this big family of European families. We have to give you a sense of how big this change was, is just to mention several facts. First of all, we're talking about 75 million of new citizens of the European Union. This was to be a big change. And this big group of population was also different compared to the old member states in many ways. So I just made a sample of several characteristic features that I thought may capture your attention. One thing is that this group was relatively younger than the population in Western Europe. For example, the group between 15 and 24 years of age was 19% in the new member states compared to just 15% in the EU of 15 countries. So you can imagine all the pressures and the things, the consequences that the fact of the younger generation coming to the European Union would bring. Also, unemployment was much higher, almost twice higher in the eastern parts of the continent than in the western part. For example, it is 11% in the new member states compared to the just 6% in Western Europe. Another interesting fact, the group of manual workers was smaller compared to Western Europe. Talking about jobs, talking about the pressure on the job markets in Western Europe, some things that Professor Thiel just mentioned, we can start now to think about where the pressure would be, what kind of jobs would be put under pressure by the coming of the new East Europeans. And something that I really thought was very interesting is that even in terms of political orientation, this new group of citizens was quite different. And one of the interesting things, remember, we're talking about 8 post-communist countries. And when they did a survey about the political orientations of the citizens of all 25 new states, what they figured out in 2004 was that the group of the leftist-oriented people was much higher in Western Europe and not in Eastern Europe. Just compare the figures, 22% in the new member states and 36% in Western Europe. So we have a totally different type of, not totally, but population that was different in some ways. Now, what changed in these new countries? What are the changes that followed? If you visited East and Central Europe, and I don't know how many of you have been there in the region. Are there people here in the audience who? Okay, there may be a couple. Yes. Okay, so if you went there in 2004 and 2003, let's say, and today, well, what you will see is at least two changes that I can think of, which you can see just by walking the streets. One is that you will see the blue flag with the yellow stars everywhere and signs. This was built with the help of European structural funds. That was built, a street or a metro station or whatever was built because of aid coming from the European Union. The second thing that one would notice is that there are fewer people smoking in public buildings and restaurants. And maybe you've heard that the East Europeans are committed to smoking. And this is really a very big change. Why did it change? Because they were forced to impose the laws and the standards for the entire European Union, which forbids smoking from public places. So this was quite a shocking thing to happen in these countries. But let's talk about other effects. It does. So 10 years while we work on this, 10 years later, can we be satisfied with the progress that was made by these Europeans? Thinking about the changes, we can look at them and start to understand them grouped in three sectors. So we wanted to see positive changes in three areas after the enlargement of the East European countries. One is the expectation that the enlargement would help consolidate democracy, make democracy stronger in these countries. The democratic change that started to develop in 1989, because this year we also celebrate 25 years since 1989 and the collapse of the communist regimes in the region. A second area of change was we wanted to see reforms that were happening more consistently and at the highest speed. And thirdly, we also expected to see a stronger sense of belonging to Europe, the socialization process within the European Union of these new citizens, of those 75 million of people who just joined. So how well did they do? I will start with the first one, democratization. There have been some positive and some not so positive developments. First of all, if we take the issue of political rights and civil liberties, overall we can say that these countries continue to be freer than countries that did not have the chance to join the European Union. When I see freer is that all of them, for example, were ranked by Freedom House as free countries, so countries where there is respect for political freedoms and civil liberties and human rights. Now, it is important also to know who we compare with. So, if we compare to other post-communist countries which did not join the EU, the picture is totally in favor of these new member states. They are considerably freer. Now, there is some backsliding, though, which Professor Thiel just mentioned about. And let's talk about this, because this is really the area where much of the concern that we have today about these countries lies. The populist backlash. It happened sooner than expected, some people would say. almost immediately after accession. What happened was we saw in Poland, we saw in Hungary, we saw in Slovakia, then we saw in Bulgaria, we saw in other places where the transitional elites, the elites that carried out the transition during the 1990s, were removed from power, and what happened was new parties started to emerge and win elections and form governments. And these new parties mostly were populist and personalistic type of organizations, of movements. Why are we concerned about this? First of all, because many of them didn't have quite a well-developed ideology. All of them ran on the platform that they are against the corrupt transitional elite. They blamed the elite of the 1990s that they for betraying the people. So the only thing that they were promising was, we will save you from the people, for the good people. We will save the good people from the corrupt elite. What we also see is two forms of populism in Eastern Europe: hard and soft. In the soft cases, these are still pro-European parties with a populist agenda, promising big things, like in Bulgaria, for example, the Saxe-Coburg-Gotski government promised to change everything dramatically in 800 days. That's it. Now, every one of you can imagine that this cannot happen. It's not realistic. But the most important thing is there will be no corruption. So this was the promise that they committed to. But more or less, this group of the soft populists was pro-European. So they would listen to what is happening in Brussels and what the advice from there would be. Not always willingly, but still at the end they would do what they were asked to do. There is also, however, the hard form of populism, where you have populist parties that combine also some Euroscepticism, some nationalistic elements, and xenophobia even. And I will go through a few cases which will help you understand what kind of governments we're talking about. In Poland, it happened the next year. So in 2004, Poland became a member of the European Union. In 2005, the party Law and Justice, led by the twin brothers Kaczynskis, came to rule the country. Well, it's true that they held there only for 2 years, and they're still the second big parliamentary group in the Polish Sejm. But they came to power, and since 2005 they have become the party has become more conservative, it has radicalized, more nationalistic. Hungary, Viktor Orban's name is a name that perhaps all of you have heard. We have been very concerned after Fidesz came to power in Hungary about the way the country was governed, and the ideology of the party, which initially in the 1990s was pro-liberal, was very much part of the anti-communist part of the political spectrum, and then year after year it became more radical, more conservative, and more Eurosceptic. There have been some quite controversial constitutional changes which were initiated by Orban's government, and interestingly, some of these had to be revoked just because the European Union intervened and Brussels protested against such illiberal developments in Hungary. Orban has been very harsh on the media and on civil society, and his authoritarian style of leadership is what troubles many of us. Then you have Slovakia, Smer, led by Fico, Robert Fico. Again, but it's a softer type of populism. They came to power, they're still in power, and they're very active in Slovakia. Even recently, the Czech Republic, that it's interesting, we never thought of the Czech Republic as a country that we would see this type of populism. Now they have a party, ANO, which in Czech means yes. Nobody knows yes to what. No, it's kind of, the only thing they say, we are against corruption. And that's it. So, but what they are for, that's not quite sure, but it's another type, another form of populistic movement there. So, talking about populism, why should we worry is the big problem. Now, there are some people who think that there are Eurosceptic parties in the West too, and they're quite right. Those parties, we're talking about the National Front in France, we're talking about parties in the Netherlands, about parties in Germany, almost everywhere in Western Europe. They have sent members to the European Union Parliament, and they have sent more members than the new member states in Eastern Europe. So one would say, well, the new member states, they just suffer the same ills. Why should we worry? Why should we worry? Because these are not consolidated democracies yet. We don't want them to have this type of political actors. Plus, in Central Eastern Europe, they came to power, they formed governments. And that's what especially troubling. Should we have expected this backlash? Maybe we should have. And here I don't quite agree with the hypothesis that the populists came to power because of the European Union. The East Europeans didn't have the time to enjoy their independence. Because the idea of joining Europe and European Union was extremely popular. Throughout the 1990s, huge majorities in these countries. It was not an elite-driven process only. The public wanted EU membership. So we have these countries being very active in pursuing the membership. I think that the coming of populism is more a result of the very difficult reforms, economic reforms through which the East Europeans went through in the 1990s. And this was a reaction against some of the measures that had to be undertaken. It remains to analyze in more detail which one holds and which one will turn out true, but just keep in mind that it's more complicated than just we were invaded by the EU. They were not invaded by the EU. And yet another way to think about this is, and to try to assess the threat of populism, is to compare to other countries. Why compare only to West European countries? Compare to other countries, to countries such as Russia, Latin America, and then see who was more successful and where populism posed a bigger threat. Just think about Vladimir Putin in Russia, and you can start to build a picture from a comparative perspective. The most important thing is whether these countries have really developed the capacity to sustain the democratic developments in the future. With regards to economic reform, what has changed? Many things changed. Maybe we don't see the change as big as it should have been, because these 10 years, it's a long period of time, but these 10 years were not normal years. Why? Because only 4 years after the accession, the economic crisis started. And we cannot really not account for this development. Immigration followed because of the crisis. Fears arose among the public about the job market, about the jobs, about social benefits, and so on and so forth. The least affected country in the region was Poland. Interestingly, we will be talking a lot about Poland. Poland received about 67 billion euro from the European structural funds. So this helped the country a lot, but maybe there were also other things that helped. We'll get back to Poland in a minute, but just keep in mind that they really received this huge amount of money to help their economy. With regards to corruption, and we heard some things about corruption, interestingly, if you compare the levels to the levels of 2003-2004, you will see that there have been several countries that actually improved and reduced corruption to some extent. Poland, Latvia and Lithuania. At the same time, one of the countries that was leading, that was the cleanest one, together with Estonia, started to experience difficulties, and this is Slovenia. Slovenia performed so well until recently. However, the economic crisis of 2008 really hurt the country very much. So with regards to corruption, it also affected corruption. So apparently, Slovenia became more corrupt than we thought it would be. Has there been economic growth? Here is a graph that I did for you. I included the years of the 1990s just for the purpose of comparison, so that you know how things had been developing until 2004. So what you can see there is the two important things. There are two drops, dramatic drops. One is in 1991. This is when they launched the economic reform, and this inevitably led to lower, very low rates of growth of GDP per capita. There is also a second big drop that you can see. The second one happened in 2009. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. This is the effect of the economic crisis that really hurt the ability of these countries to develop a stronger economy. Well, the economies were restored, and economic growth was restored. If you look at the remaining part of the graph after 2009, they kind of emerged out of this drop to the levels that they enjoyed in the early 2000s. And then the third group of issues, the socialization. Had they socialized? One interesting way to look at this is to think about how they feel. Are they ready to work for the common good? And here we should really mention Poland again and give credit to Poland as a country which really played a leadership role in the European Union. So Poland has been performing so well because it benefited that much. Yes, they got those 67 billion. Maybe yes, but there is also something else going on. Poland feels responsible for what is happening in the European Union. It's at the elite level, it's also at the public level. There is a strong belief in Poland that they should contribute to the European Union. And this is a different level of socialization. This is a different type of a feeling of belonging to this family of European countries. In other places, well, we have a kind of a different picture. Most of the time what happens is countries they receive the structural funds, they do many things with them. They are less enthusiastic though, because every time something goes wrong, they blame the European Union. They're ready to do it. So you don't have this level of commitment that exists in Poland. In Slovenia, we mentioned Slovenia before, frustration grows. And now just 50% of the people really think that this is a good idea to be a member of the European Union. In the Czech Republic, recently we have a more cynical trend among the public with regards to Brussels. In Hungary, there have been voices against membership. Just a couple of days ago, it was the Speaker of the Hungarian Parliament who made a remark saying that actually Hungary may consider cancelling its membership in the European Union. this is the Speaker of the Parliament. Right? So you can start to imagine what kind of frustration exists and in Hungary, for example. And keep in mind that Viktor Orban is in power there. A government that is very much Eurosceptical and very much very populist at the same time. How do people feel after all about the European Union? Do they trust the European Union? And here is a graph that I did for you to share. If you look at the blue bars represent levels of trust in the European Union. The green bars represent level of trust in the national government. So if you, and I have these two for each country and the average for the European Union. So if you look at these, you will see that in all but one case, in one country, trust in the European Union is stronger than trust in the national government. This country, this exception, is Estonia, where you have just 2% difference. They are a little bit more confident in their national government, but the difference is not very big. But in other places, in places such as Bulgaria, Romania, Lithuania, the difference is really huge. These people trust more the European Union and European institutions than their own national government. And a similar picture can be shown also for the national parliament, for the national political parties, and for other institutions. So, in conclusion, just a few things. Overall, we can think of a positive impact of democratization and economic recovery of the EU enlargement on these post-communist countries. Yet, compliance with the EU requirements weakened in some sectors. And this was expected because the leverage that the European Union now has over these countries is not the same as it used to be on the eve of accession. When all of these Europeans, that they had to work very hard to meet the requirements in order to be accepted. Once they were in the club, they could start thinking about ways to somehow violate and not fulfill this and that. Brussels will continue to help overcome the populist backlash. This is something that we have seen signs from Brussels that they will continue to be active in this regard. So, positive expectations, but we can say with certainty that they will hold if these positive attitudes towards the European Union and its institutions continue. If they're sustained, then there is a good prospect for the post-communist countries, new members of the European Union to succeed. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
After an hour, maybe I have to do a song and dance to make sure the rest of you stay here. We've gotten a very good picture of what was happening inside of East Central Europe as 10 countries by 2007, 11 countries by 2012 entered the European Union. Countries that have a very, very different background, that had long periods of communist rule, that happen to sit pretty close to Russia, the Russian Federation. And what I want to focus on is the impact that this whole process of integration has had on international relations, or the impact that security relations in Europe have actually had on this particular process. As all of you probably are aware, 25 years ago, as the East European Communist bloc disintegrated, the Soviet Union went into history, there was this phenomenal level of enthusiasm on both sides that Russia was going to enter what Mr. Yeltsin used to refer to as the normal world. And that Russia is going to become a part of Europe, and that the conflicts that had characterized the last 40 years were simply going to go away. The first President Bush used to talk about a new world order that was in the process of being created. Almost immediately, however, this honeymoon began to show problems, and by the mid-90s, Russia and the West, Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, were in the process of having a number of serious problems. For Russia, the number one issue was NATO expansion. And from the early 90s on, Russia made very clear that it simply could not accept NATO expansion, that the West had promised, or implied at least, that the unification of Germany, that there wasn't going to be any more NATO expansion. Russians increasingly saw NATO as a continuation of a Western Cold War instrument, and nothing that Washington could say, or Brussels, now use Brussels for NATO, as opposed to the EU, nothing it could say dissuaded large numbers of Russians from the view that this was a continuing security concern. The EU was a different matter. In the 90s, the Russians evidenced basically no concern about EU expansion. They saw the Central European countries incorporated into Western economic institutions as unthreatening, non-threatening. But by the end of the 90s, as I mentioned before, there's a number of growing conflicts between Russia and the West. I just list them here. The whole issue of ex-Yugoslavia. The Soviets, the Russians rather, were not enthusiastic about Western intervention in Bosnia, or even more in Kosovo a couple of years later. They saw U.S. unilateralism, U.S. or international unipolarity as a reduction of Russia's potential role in the world. They were very concerned when the U.S. revitalized the idea of an anti-ballistic missile system. Targeted against whom was the question that was raised in Moscow. So that by the end of the 90s, the political environment, this is before Mr. Putin. Putin comes to power beginning of 2000. So by the end of the 90s, there's this list of issues on which Russia and the West disagree. In my view, all of them have something to do with status. Russians, Mr. Putin's, and not just Mr. Putin, lots of Russians, view that Russia is being dissed, that Russia's greatness, its historical and current greatness, are being disregarded, that Russian interests simply are not taken into account, that the Russians jump up and down and say no NATO enlargement, and NATO enlarges. NATO enlarged in 1997, NATO enlarged in 2004, NATO was on the verge of enlarging again in 2008, I'll come back to that in a moment. So that increasingly in Russia, and especially I would argue with Mr. Putin, the West, the US in particular, NATO in particular, and eventually the EU, are viewed as serious threats to Russia's role in the world. I don't have time to develop the argument, but I would argue, I do argue, that the West pursued a policy of containment already back under Bill Clinton in the early to mid-1990s, and the Russian claims, Mr. Putin's claims that Russia has attempted to contain Russian influence in post-Soviet space is not inaccurate. Anyway, after the rise of Mr. Putin as a political actor, and as I said, this is in 2000, Russian policy changes rather dramatically. It actually started to change under Yeltsin, but after 2000, it's very clear. Mr. Putin sets his agenda. We're going to recreate Russia as a great power. We're going to become the dominant power in Eurasia. We're going to become, once again, respected and play a role in international politics. And in some respects, Putin lucked out. The world demand for energy, which Russia happens to have, skyrocketed, as you're aware. Prices skyrocketed. And The Russian economy, which had bottomed out in 1998, is revitalized. And by the early 2000s, 2-3 years into Yeltsin's presidency, the Russian economy is really making significant headway. Here's the map of EU expansion with the light blue colors are the countries that we're talking about. In particular, the purple countries in the southeast of Europe are Romania and Bulgaria, those that entered the EU in 2007. The countries to the east, to remind you, immediately to the east of Poland is Belarus. Immediately to the east of Poland as well, and Slovakia, is Ukraine. Moldova is this little piece right to the northeast of Romania, and everything east of there is Russia. So that this is the region that entered the European Union. Now, what happens, as I mentioned before, I think Putin sets Russian goals as re-establishing Russian dominance in Eurasia and re-establishing Russia's equal, and I think Putin, almost any time he says anything about foreign policy, talks about Russian equality. The Russians have to be treated like an equal member of the international community. Russia, as I mentioned, the economy takes off once again in large part because of energy. Secondly, Mr. Putin re-establishes domestic stability, basically with a club. He uses the legal system, he uses a variety of other things to suppress domestic political opposition, so that over the last decade, especially since, say, 2003, 2004, Putin has begun to recreate once again a very authoritarian, non-democratic political system. There are many in the West who argue that Russia was a failed democracy. I don't think it was a failed democracy, or is a failed democracy. The leadership isn't committed to democracy. It's committed to a facade democracy, electoral authoritarianism, if you will. So, by the middle of the last decade, Russia is pretty much back economically. And then a whole series of developments occur that I think have major impact, and this gets us back now into the EU. 2003, 2004, 2005, so-called color revolutions take place. Some of you may have heard of them. The first of these is in Georgia, the second is in Ukraine, the third is in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia, and in all of them, nominally pro-Western, nominally democratic political forces come to power, overthrow Mr. Putin's friends. Who are Mr. Putin's friends? Mr. Putin's friends are relatively corrupt, authoritarian political leaders with whom he can do business. So Moscow had a relatively easy time doing business with Kiev in 2003. By 2005, they got a real problem. They got these guys that they have to deal with who are much more interested in establishing relationships with the West, in joining the EU, so that these color revolutions represent a security, from a Russian perspective, a security threat, because they are part of something else that the Russian leadership is concerned about, and that is the potential erosion of power of this authoritarian elite that now runs Russia, the clique around Mr. Putin, so that the color revolutions, which are fantastically, the Russian argument is they're bought by, paid for by the West. They also had real deep local roots. But what is evident is the EU, the West, the United States, Western NGOs played an extraordinarily important role in training, educating, funding these particular organizations. Poland was probably the most significant external actor in supporting the Orange Revolution in the middle of the last decade in in Ukraine. So that one of the points that's been made already about the increasingly vital role of Poland within the EU plays out in these developments in 2005. Russia sees the Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution as threats, and over the next 4 or 5 years, Russia plays an active role in seeing to it that these are reversed. In Ukraine, many of you are probably familiar with the so-called gas wars. 2006, 2007, in the middle of winter, the Ukrainians and the Russians, and both sides are largely responsible for this. It's not a one-sided, but they have arguments about what to pay for gas and what to pay for transit fees. And in the process of this, the Ukrainians start stealing gas because the Russians stop delivering it, but they're stealing the gas that is intended for Western Europe. So the Russians close the pipelines, and large numbers of citizens of EU member countries spend several weeks in the middle of winter in 2009 with no heat and no energy for their factories, etc. These problems had arisen before between Ukraine and Russia, but the Russians were dealing with a like-minded, more malleable Ukrainian government. They're now dealing with what they view as the potential enemy. So that reaching negotiated settlements in 2006 and 2009 become more difficult. In the case, now I'm talking now mainly about Russian responses to what are EU-supported, EU-relevant developments. A second major development by the early, well, really after 2004, is the impact of the new members on EU policy towards Russia. The Poles, the Estonians, the Lithuanians, the Latvians did not bring fuzzy, cordiality to the relationship that might have existed or evolved somewhere else in Western Europe. The Poles and the Lithuanians, for example, by 2006, 2007, vetoed negotiations between the EU and Russia for an extension of a special treaty arrangement. This treaty, I think, came to an end in 2007. They were supposed to negotiate a new one. And both Poland and Lithuania were having their own problems in Russian relations. The Russians, in terms of trying to put pressure on the Poles, decided overnight that Polish meat was unsafe, and they basically closed down 40% of the export market for Polish meat. They did this to Georgian products as well. This was the typical Soviet, or the typical Russian response in its conflicts with its near neighbors was to turn off the gas, threaten to turn off the gas, turn off the oil, discover or announce that all of the work visas for the 2 million of your citizens who are working in Russia are going to be canceled. Russian treatment of other former Soviet neighboring countries has been relatively brutal on occasion. And so that this becomes an issue as well. Also by the middle of the 2000s, and this is in part because of the new membership, the EU continues to berate, almost in school-norm fashion, to berate the Russians and try to teach them about what democracy really means and what human rights are, so that it's not just Washington that is chastising the Russians for their ill treatment of ethnic minorities or of Chechens. It's also the European Union, led increasingly after 2005 by Central Europeans. So that I would argue, by the end of the last day, the EU and Russia were at odds on a whole series of issues. And with the turning off of the gas, and the whole question, is Russia a reliable energy supplier? And there have been discussions and debates, not much action, but discussions and debates within the EU about finding alternative sources of energy. Okay, I know we're getting very late, and what have I got left up here? So, the Russian Russians view the EU, I would argue, increasingly as a challenge to authoritarian systems. And authoritarian systems in place. I mean, good friends in Ukraine and elsewhere, and this has been an extremely important aspect of Russian response. The relations between Russia and the EU, by the end of the last decade, were pretty sour on most issues. That major treaty that I was talking about before has still never been negotiated. There have been negotiations, but there's been no resolution of that. So Russian relations with the EU are still based on agreements negotiated back in 1995 or 96. I didn't mention the Eastern Partnership. Those of you familiar with the EU know that the EU not only has established a set of policies for its members, its potential members, but also it already in the last decade set a set of policies for dealing with its near neighborhood, countries that were not really candidates for membership, but we would like them to be democratic and stable, and we really would like to impose all of our rules and regulations on them without really admitting them into the Union. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but one of these was the so-called Eastern Partnership, and the Eastern Partnership is a set of policies agreed to 10 years ago now, to set up special relationships with 6 post-communist states: Belarus in the north, Ukraine, Moldova, and the 3 Transcaucasian republics. And this is what some of what the Russian-Ukrainian battle has been about over the course of the last year. Okay, I'm not going to go into the detail. When Russia did intervene in Georgia in 2008. So I see this as part of a piece of Russian response. 2008, George W. Bush was pushing Ukrainian and Georgian membership into NATO. The Russians, once again, for the, umpteenth time, are saying, no, we simply are not going to accept this. And I view the military intervention in Ukraine in 2008 as a clear message, first of all, to Mr. Saakashvili. Saakashvili was then president of Georgia. Secondly, to the still orange government in Ukraine, to NATO headquarters in Brussels, and also to Washington. We are now back. We're a major power. We're not going to let you encroach further into our, what we see as our legitimate sphere of interest. And President Bdmv, the guy who sort of is bookended by Mr. Putin, Bdmv, soon after the Russian intervention in Georgia, laid out Russian policy and justification, and one of the justifications was that Russia had a legitimate right to intervene in areas of special importance and special interest. The Russian-Ukrainian conflict is, in many respects, more of the same. Russia sees it as the West's intervening in a legitimate area of Russian interest. The West, including the European Union, because the European Union has played an important role. And the confrontation of the last year now is one that involves not just Russia and Ukraine, but also the European Union and the United States. Here, I thought I had these up earlier, but these are Russian troops entering Crimea. These are obviously not tanks. I put the title on, these are Russian troops last week. These, you will note, they are unmarked military vehicles. They have just crossed the border from Russia into Ukraine. Russian involvement has gone significantly beyond just the kinds of economic pressure that had characterized policy a decade ago. Future developments, I don't think they're positive. I think, first of all, the European Union is incapable of acting. There is, in the foreign policy area, there is no agreement among the members on virtually anything, including the very, very important issue of energy dependence. Germany has one policy, which is strike a special deal, put a pipeline under the Baltic, and we're safe. We've got our gas from Russia. The issue that is raised by Poland and other Central European countries is you've left us out in the cold. You simply have abandoned us by refusing to pursue a coherent policy. So, on the one hand, the EU is not in a strong bargaining position. It is dependent for the foreseeable future. Western economic sanctions are not likely to have a major impact because this is an issue of geopolitics. This is an issue of status. It's not an issue for the Russians. And this is not an issue of, are we going to make some bucks? Is it going to cost us something? And, as you may have noted 2 days ago, the Russians have an out. They just signed another major deal with the Chinese. So, the one area where the West has it, well, it's hardly a strong threat to say we're going to stop buying your gas if you don't have gas coming from someplace else. So 40% of all the energy consumed in the EU comes from Russia. A couple of years ago, right? You know, on average. How do you use that as a pressure tool against the Russians? Unless you find alternatives, American gas exported to Western Europe might be an answer a decade from now, not next week, not next year. So this is the one issue. The West is not in a strong bargaining position. The Russians are very clear what the West's potentials are, and they're in the process of finding alternative markets for their energy. And China, as you no doubt are aware, China is this still expanding economy with virtually no indigenous energy sources, at least gas and oil, and Russia is a major potential player. So, I don't see this whole relationship being resolved in the immediate future. The relations between the EU on the one hand and Russians, between the Russians and the US, are likely going to continue at this very conflictual level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both for very informative parts. So now it's up to you to ask questions that may interest you, to any of us. So please, anyone got some questions? Yes, please.
I have 2 questions.
Can you just speak up a little so we all... Oh, you have a mic. Perfect. Please just tell, if you want somebody specific to answer that as well.
You guys talk, or I can't really see your name from here, but you talked about how when the 2008 financial crisis happened, how Slovenia suffered, I would say, more dramatically than the rest of the European Union. I just want to know specifically why.
Okay, the question is,
Yeah.
well, just in brief, the big problem that they had was with the banking sector. So we know what happened in Greece, and we know all this in Spain and other places where the banks really went through turmoil. So in Slovenia, they had a similar issue with some of the banks and the connections to the other countries in Europe with regards to the available funds in those. There was also one trial that showed convincingly, many people thought, that the government hasn't been very transparent, was not very transparent in the way they handled the crisis and the things. And one interesting detail of this is that the former Prime Minister Janša was actually sentenced to jail time because of a corruption scandal, of the way how public funds that the total outcome in economic terms for Slovenia was minus 12% during the period between 2008 and 2013 with regards to economic growth. And this is quite a lot compared to the rest of
And can I just quickly add, very quickly add on, because Slovakia was one of the few countries from the new member states who had the euro, right? Did they use it?
No,
Slovenia. Oh, Slovenia. Was Slovenia? Yes. But the euro crisis now is, of course, with most countries not having the euro yet of the new member states. So the euro crisis has also weakened the trust somewhat into the EU, right? So I think, at least for me, this is part of the explanation of sort of the nationalism and populism in some of the countries of Central Eastern Europe, that they look to the West, but they saw that the euro crisis has shown them that you can't really rely on a safe, stable, prosperous EU anymore, right? So what's left? You retreat back to your national borders.
And then I had just one more question was, when you said that Poland has felt a sense of responsibility towards the European Union, was that due to them benefiting so greatly from the 67 euros that they received?
I think that's obviously a very important part, but important as well. Poland is a large country. Poland is the size of it. I mean, Poland joins with a population in roughly the same category as the UK and France and Italy. Germany is the only country in the European Union that is significantly bigger. Poland sees itself as an emerging great power. And I think this applies not merely to the political elite, but also to a broader part of the population, that Poland has a role to play in European politics that Slovakia or Slovenia will never play. Poland has 40 million people. Poland has a large economy. Poland now has one of the key leadership positions in the European Union. So that the rest of the old members of the EU are beginning to recognize this as well. So that there's a whole set of factors, I think, that explain the Polish attitudes. Poland playing this major role within the EU, and I would argue for the last 6 years, in trying to influence policy towards Russia, and on energy, and on support for democratic political movements in Ukraine. They've also made major efforts to try to influence the political process in Moldova, which is in Belarus, which is a very authoritarian state. So the money was obviously a factor, but it's part of a much bigger set of issues.
And if I may just add, it was a lot of money, right? A huge sum of money. But also keep in mind that it's a big country, right? So 40 million people. So if we calculate per capita, then it really explains why so much is what they got. The other thing is that Poland also emerged a very important thing, more independent in terms of energy supply than the rest of Central and Eastern Europe, because they explored opportunities for natural gas. So now they extract natural gas in Poland through fracking, right? Controversial, that's true, a controversial method, but still for the Poles think that it's less dangerous to them than a future Russian invasion. So
they've also reversed the pipelines so that they can, if the Germans agree, they can actually turn the pipelines around and bring gas into Poland from Germany, which is their immediate neighbor to the west, so that they are in a more independent position than, say, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, which depend 99% on Russia for their gas and oil.
And then lastly, of course, I also think that, the leadership in the country itself plays a role, right? And after the Kaczynski brothers, during the Kaczynski years, 2005, 2006, Poland was a pain, okay? So you had, Poland was complaining to the EU at every opportunity that they had, the government, they're not going to do this, they're not going to do that, right? trying to push back. With the new government of Tusk and from the civic platform, that was much more of a pro-European government, expressively so, and so Poland, of course, the leadership has also helped to really consolidate a good relationship with the EU. Yes, please. Victoria.
It's a little hard to see your name, but this is directed toward the last speaker, and then whoever would like to jump in after.
Professor Kennedy.
Thank you. In your last slide, you said that you don't see any possible positive solution for the EU to actually work with Russia. I want to know why, in your opinion.
Mr. Putin has written off the West. I mean, he's made this very clear. I mean, he hasn't quite said that, but he's basically said, I would argue, on and off, ever since 2005, the West does not respect us. The West simply will not support our policy goals, and we no longer need the West to accomplish those policy goals, and we're going off on our own. A couple of things, beginning, as I mentioned before, especially the EU, but also other Western European institutions, were constantly berating the Russians for human rights policy, and for lack of democratization, and for slipping behind. And about 2006, the Russians came out with this major propaganda campaign. We have our own kind of democracy. We have sovereign democracy, and sovereign democracy means, first and foremost, we pay attention to nobody else's ground rules. So that you've had now for the better part of a decade, Russia claiming that the single most important threat to global security is the United States, or NATO. It depends upon which one he's focusing on. Secondly, he has responded very, very negatively to European meddling in the what he views in the internal affairs of Russia, as well as in Russia's near neighborhood, which is this Russian sphere of influence. And okay, the Russians have reinitiated modernization of their nuclear weapons. They have significantly upgraded, probably after the Chinese. They've spent more in the last 5 or 6 years in rehabilitating, rebuilding a military. The Russians actually have an army again. 7 or 8 years ago, they had nuclear weapons, but they really didn't have a usable military. So they've done a whole bunch of things. Now, improvement of relations could occur if the West accepted the Russian ground rules, but I don't think Western Europe, the European Union, is going to accept the Russian ground rules, and until the Russian leadership changes its position, I don't see Russia changing its position as well. Anybody else?
And of course, Putin is very smart, right? And I think he uses this divide and conquer rule right now, where he goes and makes deals with individual countries like Hungary, right? Like Serbia, Moldova. So already preventatively, he goes in Bulgaria, I think, also, right? He goes into these countries, even EU member states, and tries to establish certain trade, particular energy links, so to take them out of actually the sphere of the influence of the EU, right? Because he knows that the EU, like you already said earlier, they have a hard time coming to a common agreement over sanctions, because you have to have the agreement of 28 countries with different relations to Russia, right? So Putin, in his back of his head, already said, like, oh, you know what? They don't really have very powerful sanctions, economic sanctions right now, and in 1 or 2 years, I have oil for another 20 years, but 1 or 2 years, those sanctions will be lifted, or at least they will not be strengthened, right? So he knows how to play out the EU. He's very smart as a geostrategic strategist.
Thank you.
Way back here. Just talk real loud.
Considering the history of Poland, especially as an oppressed population, and the history, basically how the country was destroyed during different wars, do you think it's as an external factor, it's a protection what they trying to expose to the outside world that they're actually now consolidating their power. Because from what I see, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, right, the first thing that the Polish Prime Minister said is Poland's next. So how strong is this fear of power of Russia towards Poland?
Well, the fear is very strong. All research that we have done so far shows that the fear from Russia has been very strong since the very beginning, since 1989. In the early 1990s, when these countries were applying for NATO membership, fear of Russia was Russian invasion. It was the first thing they would bring up. And at that time, the Western countries and Western politicians were asking them, why do you want to become NATO members? The Cold War is over. Russia started to democratize. There is no reason of why you should worry, and to just be neutral. President after president, the presidents of the Baltic republics, the president of Poland, the president of the Czech Republic, everybody would say, well, neutrality, maybe this is a good idea for Switzerland and Austria. It's not an option for us. So the fear from Russia has always been there. It's a very strong factor.
Yeah, there's a book published around 2000 that tracks the parliamentary debates in all of these countries that preceded applications for NATO membership, and every place. This was, every one of these countries, this was probably the #1 issue that was discussed in Parliament. Not just in Poland, but in the Baltic republics and elsewhere as well. So that the history that you refer to is one that the collapse of the Soviet Union did not wipe it out for Poles and Czechs and Hungarians. What they feared was a revival of a Russia that then once again became assertive.
And now they have a reason to say, we told you.
Who was first? I think Chris in front, and then John.
So this past weekend was the 25th anniversary of the Berlin Wall fall. At the ceremony, Gorbachev had a few comments that he spoke about that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that U.S.'s attitude and the West's attitude towards Russia was a negative attitude that has led to the state we are now. He says that we're on the brink of another Cold War. I know you touched up about the whole scenario, but how much you think of like what he said is just fear mongering or is actual reality?
I think it's reality. Now, I can't argue that had the West behaved differently, Russia might not have gone the same way. My argument is that what the West did between 91 and 98 or so contributed to the fearmonger, those in Russia who were more assertive, more nationalistic, who were not supportive of the kinds of reforms, whether they would have had as strong a voice had Russia really been integrated into decision-making issues, for example. I have no idea. The issues, but I think the issues that Gorbachev is referring to is almost immediately the U.S. gets involved militarily through the Partnership for Peace in all of Russia's neighbors. Now, was this only a goodwill gesture, or was this to influence and stabilize independent post-communist countries? I think it was probably both. In Moscow, it was seen as NATO expansion into Russia's legitimate sphere of interest. The U.S. almost immediately began pushing alternative pipelines. Central Asia is extraordinarily rich in natural gas, but also oil. Now, how do you get it to Western Europe if you don't send it through Russia? And if it goes through Russia, this is the argument, then it gives the Russians even more influence over energy. So we got to find alternative paths. And the U.S. was probably the single most important country in pushing for a pipeline that went from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Central Asia in general, across the Caspian, and then we have minor problems doing this because obviously you can't go through Iran. But the U.S. was a major pusher of that. And so I think that the other issues were on almost every issue of confrontation, the Russians voiced their views. Now this is, I think, Gorbachev, and the West said, we hear you, and then went on and did something very different. Now, maybe it would have been impossible to respond to some of these Russian concerns. But as I said before, I think what Western policy did was confirmed, for many Russians, the worst case scenario. The Putin argument is, we were down and you kicked us into someplace. That the West took advantage. And it wasn't just the United States, it wasn't just NATO, it was the EU as well. Now, I mean, this is the Russian position. The West took advantage of Russian weakness, and that's going to stop. So I think that there is much to be supported in that argument. Some of you, those of you who are taking IR theory courses, obviously know the work of John Mearsheimer. John Mearsheimer is an extreme example of a neo-realist. And Mearsheimer has an article in the second last issue of Foreign Affairs, which is a major foreign policy journal, in which he argues the crisis in Ukraine is the West's fault. Now he argues this on the basis of his theoretical perspectives that the world has been two powers competing for influence, and if one makes certain moves almost of necessity, the other side will make counter moves. I mean, that's his argument. It goes much further than Mr. Gorbachev, by the way. Well, let me stop there. I'm talking too much.
Can I add something to this? I read Gorbachev's remarks in terms of we didn't agree with you that you expand NATO, and you broke that deal. Gorbachev was, as much as he was admired in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s because of the policies of glasnost and perestroika, I can tell you that what he said the other day was not welcome in Central Eastern Europe now, because he's speaking about a totally different thing. Now, what the East Europeans think is, well, this whole game between the West and Russia is, in their view, important, and they try to see what kind of interest has. But in terms of the interest of the East Europeans, they say we need to make our own decisions to which bloc, to which alliance, defense alliance, we want to belong. We cannot stay in a vacuum. And we made the decision to be part of NATO. Why should Russia now hinder our strive for NATO membership? This is not correct. It used to be the case that when we were under Soviet influence, it was the Soviet Union who would decide who would be members of the Warsaw Pact. Why now Russia should decide whether we should be NATO members or not? Is this democratic? That's what they asked their Western partners.
What Mearsheimer, and I agree with this, the point that's just been made, but what Mearsheimer is arguing is that ain't the way international politics works. The big guys set the rules, and the little guys have no voice. That by moving east, the West automatically challenged the Russians. I mean, this is his argument coming out of a theoretical perspective which sees all international politics dominated by power considerations, where you sit and where you are in this game, and little countries, in Mearsheimer's view, simply don't have a voice. They basically, all they can do is bandwagon. They can jump on the train going this way or that way, but they can't influence the way the train is going to go. I mean, that's his argument, and I think there's much to be said for that, not in terms of morality, not in terms of democracy, but in terms of the reality of the way in which big countries have historically, including in the 21st century, behaved. Unfortunately, we haven't gotten to the postmodern world yet. Russia hasn't joined the EU membership in the whole idea of sharing and collaborating in the sharing of political sovereignty.
Thank you. There were two more questions, and I think we need to conclude. Ladies first. Okay.
I wanted to know your opinion if you think that the younger Europeans born after 1989 at the fall of the Berlin Wall, if they will be politically active, such as, for example, the students that have been working with Russell Brand lately in the UK, or if you feel that they're going to be like the millennials here in the US.
Yeah, the people who were born after?
89 in Central and Eastern Europe.
In both areas, in both Western.
You two answer that.
Well, it's a very interesting question because of course, as in other places, we have seen lower levels of political participation on the part of the young people also in Central Eastern Europe. The other thing is, and there is heterogeneity here. It's so different from country to country, depending on how much they know about the period of the Cold War and communism. There are places in which they don't know too much, and they're just don't know enough. Sometimes I think that the students from my East European class know more than the students over there. Anyways, the thing is that knowledge, and when knowledge and political learning takes place, this increases the desire to participate in politics. And I don't think there is enough of this there. But at the same time, during the 1990s, and these are not people who were born after 89, there were huge student strikes and movements. So those were people who were born before that. But now we don't see them. There were some student movements and strikes in a couple of places, but not of the magnitude of the 1990s.
Yeah, and if I may add on to that. So if you look just in Western Europe, you also have a sort of a disengagement there. The levels of political participation, according to political scientists, is slightly higher in Western Europe across the board than in Central and Eastern Europe, for a variety of reasons. But the Euro crisis also has led to an increased disengagement of young people because they saw that neither the leftist nor the rightist parties could really effectively do anything about it, nor do they really care about the young people. So what we've seen in Europe right now is a lot of young political engagement for protest parties or even extremist parties, okay? Which is not necessarily the political participation that you want to have. Another point I want to very quickly make is that what's interesting in Poland, remember I told you, over 1.5 million or 2 million Poles, young Poles, went to the UK and Ireland in 2004, 2005, when the Polish economy wasn't doing so well, right? To search for better life, better jobs there. Poland, since it's become so successful economically during the Euro crisis, many young Poles returned to Poland, and of course they brought in their impressions from living in the UK, from a functioning liberal democratic country, right? So some theorists say that actually that sort of inner EU migration, when they bring the experience from a fairly good functioning country back to the home country, that helps democratically transform and consolidate countries such as Poland as well, which might explain why Poland right now is doing so much better in terms of democratic quality. Yes, one more question, please. I think John was in the back.
Yeah, following on some of the questions that have been asked already, I was wondering if anyone wanted to comment on Russia's use of responsibility to protect in terms of ethnic rescue. And is the EU's ambivalence over Georgia and Ukraine more likely to cause situations in which we will see them invade other countries on the basis that they have sizable ethnic Russian populations?
Well, let me respond a little bit. The Russian use of the responsibility to protect argument, I think, is a tit for tat. You use it, and we're going to use it too. They used it to justify military intervention in Georgia, arguing you did this in Kosovo, we were against it, we thought it was inappropriate, but if you can do it, I mean, basically the Russian argument was very blunt, if you can do it, we can do it. So their justification for intervention in South Ossetia and Abkhazia really piggybacked off the Western arguments for military intervention in Kosovo. And they've made, I mean, the Crimea case, they made more or less the same argument. I don't think that that is really driving Russian policy. I think what's driving Russian policy is this continued commitment that anybody who is an ethnic Russian or a Russian citizen is under our protection. It's fair game.
And this, of course, has had major impacts in Latvia, right, which is a NATO member state, a Baltic member state, and where, what is it, 1/3 of the population is ethnic Russian, right? So there the alarm bells really went off, and they were literally appealing to NATO right away for protection.